Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this workshop that will be on communication that will be given by Steve Roche. Just to let you know, this will be recorded because there have been quite a few people inquiring about if this could be recorded because there's all sorts of things happening. So just be aware of that. So yeah, most people probably know me. My name is Annemieke Smit. I am volunteering at the Noord Breakfast on a Dairy Farm, and last year I did a study on understanding how different types of communication by the tour guides, how they affected the knowledge and the perception of visitors on dairy farming. And part of that study involved a workshop on communication that the tour guides were provided, and that had been quite well received. So hence we thought, okay, let's offer even though we are not doing a study this year, let's offer the tour guides the same or a little bit of an adapted workshop, but more or less the same content. So be prepared for something that's an interactive workshop in which you can learn a lot. You can ask Steve all sorts of questions. Well, I'll just introduce Steve quickly, and then from there on, he will take it over, and you probably won't see me after that anymore. So Steve is the director and the principal consultant for ACER Consulting, and he has a vision for improving animal health through applied research and creative communication. And ACER is driven by his passion and interdisciplinary skill set, which blends epidemiological research, agricultural extension, and health promotion. And his mission is to develop and deliver evidence-based solutions to motivate on-farm change and improve animal health and welfare. He earned his PhD in epidemiology from the Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College, and his research explored novel approaches to improve the adoption of on-farm management practices to control Johne's disease in the Ontario dairy industry. He also holds an MSc in epidemiology and a BSc in zoology from the University of Guelph. And through his formal training and applied research experience, Steve is a well-rounded researcher equipped with the skill set, drive, and collaborative spirit to help his clients understand, inform, and influence. And I think he's the perfect person to deliver this workshop. So Steve, if you want, you can take it over from here.
Sure. Thanks, Annemieke. Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be here with you today. I see some familiar names and faces as well from our training that we did last year and a few other events that I've been part of as well. So as Annemieke mentioned, I'm based in Guelph, Ontario. I spend a lot of time working in the dairy industry, and the vast majority of my time is spent working in the dairy industry, either as a researcher, figuring out, what's causing health and welfare conditions on the farm or in specific animals, but also really excited and interested and passionate about communication. How do we talk about science more effectively? How do we talk with our supply chain as the dairy industry more effectively to inform them of what we're doing, but also to ensure that what we're doing aligns with expectations and sort of we find a way to collaborate together. I do a lot of research projects with the Canadian dairy industry, many more in the United States, and some projects in places like Australia, New Zealand, and Europe as well. And so I like to think that I've got some perspective on major issues that consumers, customers, and our supply chain have concerns about or questions about, and then thinking about how we best talk about what we do and inform what we do moving forward based on an understanding of what we think is best, what others think is best, and how we work together. So we've got a handful of slides to share with you today on some tips, some tricks, some ideas, some considerations perhaps around communication when it comes to working with the public as part of the Breakfast on the Dairy Farm, and just honestly, more broadly, some communication strategies that I think can be effective, whether it's you working with your partner, with your family, with non-family employees on the farm. I think this can be applied in a whole different number of ways. But I'm also keen to sort of understand what you'd like to get out of today, what questions you specifically have, and see if I can help add a little bit of value that way as well. So I'm pretty comfortable being as flexible and informal as we'd like. If you're happy to hear what I've got prepared, awesome. If you really want to add in your 2 cents, I'd really encourage you to do that. I know virtual can sometimes be a bit, feel a little bit formal and odd, but we'll do our best to make this as, feel as though we're together and the opportunity to discuss. Okay, so I'm going to jump in here. We'll talk a little bit about communication strategies for public engagement, specifically thinking about breakfast on the dairy farm, but also my mindset when I think about these things is also to say, well, generally, how do we talk to one another, and how do we educate one another or influence one another? My story, as I mentioned, is and Marika mentioned, is one that's sort of based in understanding animal health and welfare, and specifically focused on dairy cattle and the dairy industry. I really have a passion working with dairy farmers, their advisors, veterinarians, nutritionists, trimmers, and the industry more broadly. I tend to say I practice what's called social epidemiology. So I'm interested in why disease, how disease spreads on the farm, and what causes things like lameness and hock injuries, and what we can do about it. But more and more, what I am particularly excited about is how do we help work with people? People is what influences all of this at the end of the day. And so I am really quite interested in how we communicate more effectively, how we do extension better, and how we get information from one individual to another or one group to another, and for a variety of reasons. So ultimately, I'm interested in behavior change. And we're not doing breakfast on the dairy farm per se to change people's behavior. We might be doing it to raise some awareness, maybe to change some minds, and sure, help to inform the public or the consumer about what it is we do, why we do it, and that may either increase their trust in the industry or potentially change their behavior. But ultimately, it all starts with communication. So today I'm going to kind of chat a little bit. I want to hear from you in terms of what is your perspective on why we do the breakfast on the dairy farm type events. Why do we want to engage with the consumer, with the public more broadly? I want to talk about some assumptions and what I'd consider sort of fatal flaws, things that all of us do sometimes around communication that reduce the level of effectiveness we can have. We'll talk about some qualities around leadership and keys to success when it comes to communication. We're going to talk about how adults prefer to receive information and why that might be useful for you to think about. And then we'll talk a little bit about resistance, difficult conversations, and some take-home messages. I'm also going to keep an eye on time and make sure that we wrap up, as I know everyone's busy. We'll wrap up on time as well. So my first question for you, and as Enrica said, I do want to hear from you a little bit here as we go through, is why do we do the breakfast on the dairy farm event? What are our goals and objectives of holding these events in the first place? Can someone tell me sort of what your impression is? Why do these things in the first place? Go for it, Greg.
I guess I've always seen it kind of as like the open door policy, where we don't want to hide behind a closed barn door per se. Like we want to, when we engage in public in other areas, we want to say, well, we do welcome people onto the farm to see what farm life is, how cows are treated, and all that. Because to do what like chickens do, I guess, with biosecurity and not allowing people on the farm, I think there's a danger there where consumers will be quite concerned if they don't see that we are welcoming people on the farm.
Mm-hmm. Others agree with Greg, or would you add anything to what Greg's just said? Gazinas?
Yeah, just to give a better understanding where milk is coming from. We attract a lot of small kids as well, and they think it's coming out of the store, but then they can understand the whole story behind it, where it's coming from, how it's produced, and what is all inclined to produce it.
Yeah, I think that's great. Is just overall awareness and helping to build a better understanding of where food product actually comes from, in this case dairy. Also, to your point, Greg, I mean, it's not just other commodities that have taken a different approach. Yeah, for things like biosecurity and having more of a closed door policy per se, but we also have other provinces in Canada. Ontario has taken more of an approach of saying we're going to keep the doors shut. Now, individual farmers can take a different approach, but as an industry, it's starting to, you see some differences in terms of how open are we going to be about the public. And I think all of us in this room can appreciate there's at least a sizable gap, and maybe we could argue it's growing gap in terms of where people's understanding around where our food comes from, how it's produced, why it's produced the way it is. And then, of course, it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us that when a video comes out, and I'm not even talking about an activist video, I'm talking about a video that just shows general farm practices, there's a misunderstanding about what's happening, or just a lack of understanding, not always a misunderstanding. So I think that's a valuable to think about. So I have another question for you here. What do you expect to hear from the public? What do you think they're going to be most interested in? Many of you have done these events before, or have a sense for what they tend to be interested in. I'm sure we're going to hear, baby calves. Everyone loves to see the calves, right? Everyone loves to get outdoors. And the breakfast is kind of a nice handy piece as well. But are there any particular challenges? So someone come off mute and tell me, what do you think you're going to hear? Are there any particular challenges you think that might actually arise or have arisen in the past when it comes to communicating with the public? You can just come right off mute if you're interested in making a comment.
Yeah, as we all know, I think the two most important concerns of consumers is animal welfare and environment. So, and I think the focus in that area and an explanation more in that area, I think that could be well received, and not just downloading your information, but try to start the conversation. And that's what the last bullet here. What do you think will be your biggest challenge? And I think that's really to start the conversation with these people, and not just downloading the information about the farm. I did always the write-up for the tours, and there was more, okay, this is the farm, here are the baby calves, and so much colostrum they get. But really starting to get the people asking questions. And I think that's the most challenging part of it, because then it sticks better to them. If they ask a question and you have an answer for them, or you start the conversation, that they take that home and not just downloading information. And I think that's the biggest challenge for us all, to be more informative and not just downloading the information to them.
Thanks, Gesines. Reed, do you want to add in there?
Yeah, sure. I think kind of following up on Gesines' comments there too, is that like every group that you have coming through is very different. Sometimes you'll have somebody that's their first time ever in the country, and they have, off the wall questions, but they're like, how long does a cow live? Yep. And those can sometimes be uncomfortable things to answer as well, and they just have to give a range. But why don't the calves stay with the cows? And some, they don't care at all. They're just, how much milk does it give? And how heavy is the cow? So but it's good to have that, instead of just blabbering off about all kinds of facts that we think are important. It's more about engaging them and kind of making sure that they're getting the information that they think is important to them, because it can, the group in the next 10 minutes can be completely different than the one before. And often the question that I get asked most of all, the people that have just a little bit of knowledge, is like, when is your calving time? So because they're more familiar with kind of that beef cow thing of like, oh, spring is calving time, and they're like, oh, I'm smart, I know that. And they're like, well, yes, but so just kind of that engagement, and just being ready for answering the questions in a good way, truthful, but yeah, to the point and to your audience.
Great. I think both of those are excellent answers and really on point. I mean, a couple of things I wrote down from what you've shared in specific words. I mean, Gesines, the use of the word conversation, I think that's, it's actually obviously a simple word, but an important point, right? Is you really referred to that sort of downloading or one-way flow of information, basically telling them, here it is, this is what we do, this is why we do it, and leave it at that. It's sort of your narrative being shared with the others. And sometimes there's a time and place for that, but conversation is so much more, and I'm going to use another word you said was sticky. Retention is so much better when we have people that have an opportunity to ask a question and hear how their interests are addressed by you. And I think that's an important piece. So conversation's key. You mentioned engaging, and engagement is the same idea, right? Is making sure that we are responding and tailoring our comments, our approach, everything we do based on what their interests are, what their questions are, what they might be uninformed but want to be more aware about. So this was the subject of, as Anna-Marika mentioned, a study that Anna-Marika had helped lead. I was involved in it. It was sort of the subject of, or a side project, I guess, of the Breakfast on the Dairy Farm project last year. I'm just going to talk about 2 or 3 kind of concluding statements from it. You likely heard from Anna-Marika last year on some of the results, or more recently, I should say. You know, we get comments when we ask producers about why do this, or you know, what are your takeaways. We see comments like this: when the public walk into the barns nowadays, they see how nice and comfortable it is in the barns. They say, well, we see why the cows want to stay inside now. Or another one would be, you know, we appreciate all the work that goes into trying to manage the life, the welfare, the productivity of a dairy cow. Really, generally, you know, a much heightened awareness and understanding of what's going on in dairy farms. And generally, I think it aligns pretty well with the goals that some of you mentioned. We've seen, though, that the research also suggests that education of the public doesn't always necessarily lead to improved perception about that. So there's a couple studies that have looked at this before, and this study showed some similar results. Generally, we saw visitors that showed up on the Breakfast on the Dairy Farms last year increase their knowledge, and their overall attitude or perspective of dairy farming was improved. So they generally left with a more positive perspective. We also know, though, that a few weeks later, when we followed up with them, almost a third of them had a slightly different perspective. It was a little bit more negative, and we don't know all the reasons for that. And Anna-Marika and her team are still looking at some of those as well. But the point being is that, you know, this opportunity for engagement isn't universally effective or always seen as positive. And so some of the concerns we saw were, okay, well, you know, what about cow welfare? So cow-calf separation, lack of outdoor access, housing, no surprises here, right? These have been some of the major things that we know have been, you know, potentially viewed as contentious or talking points for our industry for some time. And many of us have different practices to address those things and different rationale. One thing I want to just, another opportunity to kind of chime in here is, I want you to think about, you know, what does good animal welfare look like to you? So can someone tell me, you know, when you think about that as a dairy farmer, what is good welfare of your dairy cow? What are some of the things that either lead to good welfare, or what are some of the outcomes that tell you your cows have good welfare? Greg, go ahead.
I guess on the health side, right? Like not no injuries, stuff like that. Good body condition, good movement, like no lameness issues. Just
Yep.
Yeah, a lot on the health side. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And some clearly some really important ones, right? Not just from a welfare perspective, but from a health and productivity standpoint as well. Other factors, Kazinas?
Yeah, I wrote down air, feed, water, and surface, like no slippery floors, and then also the stalls. I always explain to the consumer, they have it better inside than outside, because we try to copy the pasture, you know, like triple foam or deep bedding or sand bedding, the temperature with the air quality, with the fans and the cooling.
Yep.
So like you're really focusing on explaining why are these cows inside, and actually how good they have it inside.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, speaking to a lot of characteristics that result in cow comfort, right? And I think that's a important set of points. There's been a lot of research on welfare over the years, and here's a couple of different what they'll call spheres of animal welfare to think about. So we talk about sort of the biological functioning. So Greg, a lot of the things you mentioned really nicely fall in this category, right? So what's the cow's health? Are they free from disease? Are they, fed appropriately so their body condition is maintained and sort of, let's call it optimal? They don't have disease or injuries. Their hygiene is, is well looked after. Those types of details. That's the sort of the biology of it. And then we talk about sort of the affective states. This is where we've got a lot of research going on nowadays, which is talking about how do our animals actually feel in their environments. Are they experiencing pain? Are they experiencing stress, for example, or fear? This is why over the last several years, and I expect as we move forward, you're going to hear a lot more talk about animal handling. Because as we all know, there's many different ways to handle an animal and many different outcomes associated with different styles of handling. Hot shot use, for example, prod use, those kinds of things. We all have perspectives on when that might or certainly is not appropriate. And we're starting to understand the impacts that can have on animals, and not just things like prod use or using electrified crowd gates or electric cow trainers, but also just talking about low stress handling environments, or more broadly, how even noisy an environment is, those types of details. We also talk about, are these animals having a life worth living, right? And we start to get into the natural living component, where we talk about the nature of their environment, the opportunity for social contact, motivating behaviors. So not just making sure that they are free from negative experiences, but they have positive experiences as well. And this isn't just for dairy cows, this is more broadly for animals or livestock in general. And so you can see, you could define welfare or think about welfare from a variety of different perspectives. So why did I do that? Why are we talking about that? The one reason for that is to appreciate that everyone comes with a slightly different perspective. We all come into this breakfast on the dairy farm as a farmer, or as someone that's engaged from the industry perspective, as someone that's, let's call it, in the know. But we also have a certain filter or a certain set of blinders, right? We have a bias in terms of appreciating why it is we do certain things and why we don't do others. And we have to appreciate and understand that the folks that we're interacting with have a very different set of experiences, understandings, and assumptions about what good welfare is, or what dairy farming is and what it isn't. And so we need to understand those two things in order to move forward effectively. So what I want to talk about for the rest of our time together is a couple of things: the way we ask questions, the way we listen to and respond to visitor responses and questions. And I think that's going to make us more effective communicators, or more mindful communicators. In many cases, you in this group are some of the more folks that are more in tune with this style already. Even by some of your introductory comments, it's clear you are more interested in that conversation than simply, ensuring that they know the way we do things today is the right way. You're interested in having that conversation, or at least sharing some ideas back and forth. I'll make what I think is rather an obvious statement today, whether you have employees or not, whether you work with your family members or you don't, or whether you've done a breakfast on the dairy farm tour or not. Effective communication is it's probably as important now than it has ever been before. The stakes are higher, farm management is more complex than ever. We have a broader set of stakeholders, like I said, with different mindsets, and that gap or that understanding is changing more and more. So as I said at the beginning, I think it's important to appreciate that what I talk about now in terms of communication or motivating change in attitude or change in behavior, I think can be applied to your staff, so your family, your employees, your advisors, and the public more broadly. So let's talk about some assumptions and some fatal flaws here. The first one is that we often talk far too much when we're trying to influence people or when we're trying to engage. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking. I mean, you're the tour guide, so you're going to talk a lot, right? But we're often too eager to provide our recommendations or our 2 cents, and impart our specific views on why things must be done a certain way. And I think that can be a real limiting factor in terms of starting to close out the opportunity to hear others' perspectives. There's a real underlying assumption here, and I want to call this out. This is something that I've thought about a lot over the years, and I find we continue to sort of take this approach, whether we appreciate it or not. We often assume, typically subconsciously, we're not thinking about this all the time, but we often assume when we're telling people what they need, what we think they need to know, that they lack the information, right? So we need to give them the information. They just need to understand what it is we do. And based on that information, they're going to say, yeah, that's behavior, that's rational. That makes sense. And there's, I'm going to buy into the way you approach. So I always laugh about this idea of that was a very well laid out rational point, but I'm still going to hold to my emotional opinion based on no facts or evidence. Greg, you kind of alluded to that, right? It's like the facts sit over here, and then my attitude or my emotional reaction is different. And I don't care about your facts. And think about all the things that have gone on in the last year in our world, the last few years in our world. There's a lot of emotional opinions out there that are informing people's attitudes and ultimately what they think is true. So the question is, and it's a bit of a rhetorical question, is knowledge the main factor that prevents people from making changes on the farm, for example, or from thinking a certain way? No, right? But the challenge is that look how we tend to be taught, right? This is where I spent a lot of time for 10 years in university getting taught by someone else. And it's sort of this banking principle we often talk about, where it's the assumption that people have empty heads and we need to fill them up with knowledge. And once we've given them the knowledge, everything else starts to factor in. So thinking about how we are influencing the consumer in the context of the dairy breakfast on the dairy farm is, if we take the approach of saying these members of the public are going to come onto our farms, we're going to teach them what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. And based on that and that alone, they're going to have a more positive outlook on what we do because we're giving them insight into it. And of course, as we've seen from that research, is that in some cases, that's absolutely the case. And in other cases, they say, well, yeah, but why couldn't you do it differently? Or I don't agree with that, for example. And so it can break down if we have this one-way flow of information where we're always hoping to sort of control the narrative or controlling the message and basically saying, listen to what I have to say, that's going to be what you need to know. And so again, just to illustrate this point, is a lack of knowledge preventing any of these behaviors, choosing not to smoke or stopping smoking, biosecurity on the farm, or even hand washing? We know generally that we should or should not engage in these behaviors. And yet every day we see people that don't follow biosecurity protocols or don't wash their hands or continue to smoke, even though they know there's health ramifications to that. People typically require motivation and understanding, not more information. Now, that's not always the case. And in the context of breakfast on the dairy farm, they're going to benefit from and are showing up to get some information on what you do and why you do it. That's great. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying when it comes to trying to influence attitudes or change mindsets or build better rapport together, we can't just focus on delivering information. So Gazinas, again, you said that the key word, conversation, right? And so I always laugh about the idea here. There's a lot of work in psychology that actually talks about when we provide people with information when it's not needed, it's just perceived as nagging, right? And so think about all this time your partner says, can you just do that thing? You're like, I know I need to do that thing. I don't need to be told again. I just haven't done it for whatever reason. It's the perception of nagging. What we call this in psychology is reactance. When we tell people the thing that they know already, and we continue to tell them that thing as though that's going to change their behavior, we actually get a negative reaction. So put this in the context of animal welfare, for example. We've got a person that does not fundamentally understand, appreciate, or value the fact that baby calves are removed from their mothers, despite the fact that we talk about the fact that, one, we can give them everything those calves need, including we can still maintain the dam being able to lick off the calf, but we need to give it good quality colostrum. We need to worry about things like Johne's disease or other diseases in the first 24 hours or when they're born in the calving pen, for example. We can tell them all of that, but they still have a reaction that says, no, that doesn't work for me, or that's not what I think is right. And so we need to think about, well, how do we influence based on that? It's probably not more information, right? It's Greg, again, it's to your point. It's here are my facts. Well, okay, but here are my facts. Who's right? It's the emotional pieces that are either an impasse, or if we can approach it properly, we can start to use to inform a conversation. We may have to agree to disagree. What I'm not saying is that we always need to work towards a universal agreement on an issue, but we can have more effective conversations, respectful conversations, if we can better understand where we're coming from. Another thing that's important for us to think about is that you can't reason people out of positions that they were not reasoned into in the first place. In other words, a lot of us make decisions or form opinions based on emotion, not based on facts or evidence. And so again, we can't rationalize or offer up, Greg, to your point, we can't offer a bunch of facts that are going to change someone's opinion that isn't based on facts in the first place. We really need to work towards understanding their perspective. And what I mean by that is asking questions and truly listening to what they have to say. Or if we don't ask questions and they still have something to tell us, we need to listen to better understand where they're coming from, not just to respond to their question. We need to understand the root of what they're asking, not just answering the specific question they have. So when we're educating without an understanding of where they're coming from, why they're asking the question, or what they think, we actually miss the opportunity to address the root concern in the first place. So if they're asking about why the cows don't get outdoor access, we can answer that and start telling all the reasons. We created an optimal environment indoors during the winter months. I wouldn't want to be a cow outside as well. We recreate a lot of the amazing aspects of pasture inside. We can better control their environment. We could list off facts and continue on that way. A better question might be to say, why do you think they need some access to the outdoors? An opportunity to have a bit more conversation and probe their understanding and what they're really getting at before we start to determine, do I need to actually educate this person, or is it more of a response as to why we've made decisions around indoor housing in the first place? Oops. What I'm working towards here is that what we really need to better understand when trying to influence, communicate, or respond to people is understand their mindset. Their mindset is made up of a variety of things, but a lot of it is emotional. It's something that I just jumped to this a minute ago. It's something that marketers have long understood. Think about the ads that you see on the screen here. None of these actually talk about what the heck these products actually do. They're tapping into our emotions, our mindset, our beliefs, and they're influencing us more often than not related to things that we hold and value, not the facts, not the evidence. And so I think that's important for us to appreciate. We typically incorrectly assume what people we're working with want, need, and prefer. And it does lead to poor communication and team management. So we assume if someone asks a basic question, like the calving, even when Reed sent that question, I thought he was talking about calving interval, and it was even simpler than that, right? It was just, when do you calve in a year, for example. So we assume if we get a simple question like that they have, very little understanding. It's possible that's the case, but we make an assumption by simply assuming, okay, based on that question, you probably don't have a lot of knowledge. That is fair some of the time, and sometimes it inhibits our ability to actually have more effective conversations. Here's a few examples of assumptions that I've encountered in my work. I've asked plenty of veterinarians over the years, why didn't your clients participate? Here's a nutritionist. Well, a producer said, my nutritionist never brought it up. I asked the nutritionist, why not? And he said, well, I didn't think it would be of interest to him. He probably wouldn't have gone for it. They made an assumption. I asked a producer, why don't you think you don't have a problem with Johne's disease on your farm? Well, my vet never mentioned it, so I didn't think it was an issue. I rely on my vet to highlight these things. Another assumption, right? Here's a good example. I was in the Southwest. I was in Arizona a few years ago working with a very large herd, about 120,000 head of dairy cows. Tons and tons of non-family employees. The attitude, as you can appreciate, especially on large farms, is still that unless we've got a growing dairy beef operation, bull calves don't hold a lot of value. And this particular employee heard or overheard a number of people saying that male dairy calves don't really have a lot of value. So when it came to managing a number of bull calves, instead of having 3 hutches and 3 calves, or 1 hutch per calf, he had 2 clean hutches and 1 hutch with 3 calves stuffed into it. How you can even do that is beyond me. But the point is, when you follow up and say, well, why the heck did you do that? Why wouldn't you use the 2 other hutches? He said, well, I've heard people talk about the fact that we really only care about heifer calves, and so it's less work for me if I do this. Again, assumptions are leading to incorrect outcomes or undesirable outcomes. So when we think about why people do what they do and what influences them, we can appreciate that there's a whole host of different reasons. Some people are just plain ignorant. Some people are ambivalent. They can see different reasons for doing something. Some people want to have their head in the sand or simply say, I'm not going to change anything and hope the outcome will be different. I often get the question, how do you motivate those that don't want to change? How do you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink? And I often joke, it's the wrong question. We have to help them find their own motivation to change. We're putting the cart before the horse by asking that question. We can't make people change, but what we can do is to examine their narrative, their mindset. So why don't people change? Why don't they change their attitudes? Why don't they change their behaviors? Because each one of us develop a personal narrative, a personal story about why things are a certain way. This is influenced by our personal experiences, our attitudes, and our relationships. And your job, if you are truly of the mindset that you want to influence people, even their thinking, your job is to get them to examine their own narrative. So going back to that example I said about why aren't the cows, don't the cows get outside? You could answer that question very plainly and offer up your rationale, or you could ask them, what do you think? Why do you think cows should get outside? What do you think some of the benefits are of getting outside? And what do you think some of the cons are, for example? An opportunity for them to examine their own narrative a little bit. All of this starts by understanding the mindset and narrative that people have built about a specific thing. Now, you might be sitting here and thinking, I've got 15 minutes to take folks on a tour. I don't have time to be their psychologist and sit down and have a 50-minute conversation with them about the fundamentals of outdoor access. I'm not suggesting that you need to do that. All I am sort of trying to give you some thoughts around is that there can be more value in asking them the question back before you answer it yourself, or throwing the question out to the rest of the group. If I had a group come to me and someone says, why is it that we remove the calf so soon when it's born from the dam? Instead of answering that question, giving them what I know to be the right and correct information based on where I sit, I could say, what do others think? Anyone know the answer to that? That helps engage everyone. It helps get them thinking and maybe formulating an opinion, and gives you still, as long as you facilitate it, the opportunity to answer and say, you know what, a few of you are right on. That's exactly why we do that. And here's a couple other things. It allows for more of an educational approach, and people actually think about what are their assumptions. So it's all about mindset. Mindsets are unique to everyone, created by our experiences. They're imperfect. They do govern our actions and the way we see the world. They are self-protective. Really think about that one. Our mindsets are self-protective. When someone challenges us or asks us why we don't do something different, our reaction is self-protective. We explain our rationale for it. Our industry as a whole is being challenged on a whole number of fronts. Gesina's nailed it, I think, in terms of animal welfare and environment, right? And in some cases, our industry is going to be challenged in situations where we say, well, we've never had to do it some way different, so we haven't worried about it that way. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue a change or that science is telling us that we ought to change. The reality is, though, is that our first reaction is self-protective. So it creates biases, it creates blind spots. But the most important piece is that mindset can be changed. And it can be changed with help, with conversation, with discussion. So I want to stop here for a minute. And just for the interest of time, instead of breaking out and discussing this a little bit, I'm wondering if anyone would be open to coming off mute and just telling me what's a takeaway from what you've just heard. Essentially, I want to see what resonates with you, what questions maybe you have, what things do you think are interesting here? Anyone want to share?
I think that indeed changing the question to a conversation is very helpful to know that for breakfast on the dairy, because that's something I've never thought about. I was just like answering the question, go on with the tour. But indeed, asking others, what do you think about it and how do you see it, is very interesting for the rest of the group as well.
Thanks, Rose. I think I saw someone else come off mute. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I thought about for the consumer and for people who are participating, it has to be a positive experience. So that is up to the tour guide to create that. And I wrote some words down like the emotional assumptions. You can play with that. What you see in a positive experience, if you looked at advertising, what you showed as well, lately you see a lot of pets in advertising because people have something with pets, and it has nothing to do actually with the product. It's just making a nice little story, create a positive experience. And I also thought as well, like what you mentioned, uh, really think about the group approach instead of answering constantly individual questions. Like incorporate the whole group in that discussion, because otherwise and that's what we do a lot. We just answering as good as we can with our knowledge. We answer the question as good as we can. But I really, it's important what you mentioned, Steve, that we approach the whole group, connect that whole group in that discussion. And I think that's where I can focus on a little bit more as well.
Great, I appreciate that, and I think you're both right on in terms of some really practical approaches to use some of this information. What rephrasing, or what they call in facilitation sort of a boomerang question. So someone asks you the question, and instead of you answering it, you put it right back out to the group. What that does is I mean, if you can do this early on in a tour or in an interaction with someone, it demonstrates, I'm going to be here to support and answer your questions, but I'm not just going to spoon feed you the answers. I want to hear from you. I want you to think about some of these things. That's what the goal of this is. And to be honest with you, I've got it later in my presentation, but I'll bring it up now. One of the best things you can do to set yourself up for a positive experience, for an educational experience, and an effective experience is to tell them very explicitly what they can expect of you and what you expect of them. And I don't mean that you don't need to be particularly stern about it, but I really enjoy saying, you know what you can expect out of me is I'm going to take time to answer your questions, but I'm also going to challenge you. I want to hear from you. I want to know what you have to say, and I need your feedback. That's what's going to make this tour more effective. That's what's going to help me understand where it is you might be more interested in learning at. Yes, we're going to get to see the cute calves. We're going to get to see all of the areas of the farm, but I also want to hear from you, and I'm going to ask you some questions, and I expect you to ask me some questions as well. Each of you will have your own personal style in how you might take that approach, but what I'm explaining here is making the implicit explicit. In other words, not making an assumption that people know they can answer or ask questions and you'll answer them, but really getting them to think about some of these things, and calling that out ahead of time sets yourself up, or cues people, or primes people to be thinking about that as we move forward. And the first opportunity you get a question, if you can put that back out to the group, it signals to everyone, this is how this tour is going to go. He's going to take time to ask my questions. There is no such thing as a stupid question. And if I ask something that seems a little bit silly, or I'm a bit uneasy about it, he's not going to make me feel bad about asking that. He's going to ask genuinely what other people think, and we're going to help. This is going to be fun and educational. So just a little tidbit there for me as I think about that. One other thing you can think about is the fact that we know from decades and decades and decades of research that there are a number of things that tend to create more positive experience in terms of learning, and that's adult learning. Adults are, they have a series of preferences, and if we can tap into those preferences and offer information through this sort of lens or filter of adult learning, we can tend to be more effective. We know from research that adults need problem-centered learning. They need to focus on a problem or a reason for learning something. They are most motivated by subjects that are relevant to them, whether that's their work, whether that's their life. They bring experience to the table, and it's the basis, it's the basis for their learning, and it includes mistakes. I'm going to get into that again in a moment. And they need to be involved in how they learn. So let's talk about that. I do a lot of talks and work with producers a lot. So you'll see a lot of my pictures are focused on situations where I've run farm tours, or I've worked with groups of farmers on how they themselves could improve on specific management practices. But I'll try to apply this in the context of consumers as well. We know adults are problem focused. We are oriented towards solving specific problems, or understanding specific problems, or achieving specific goals. So If you're taking a walk through the farm, what are some of the problem areas? Or you'd probably prefer to talk about it in a positive light. What are some of the focus areas for this farm? What are their goals? What have they been focusing on lately? When I go on farm, I'm always asking about what's your project? What's the challenge lately? What have you been focused? What's going well? Sharing real life examples of what's working, what's not, and how farms or this particular farm is endeavoring to improve is, makes this feel real. It demonstrates that we're not perfect here. We're working towards improvement every day, towards a variety of things. It presents an opportunity to address specific things or specific problems that people might be aware of. But it's also important to ask questions. What do you see as some of the key challenges we need to work on? Adults bring experience to the table. It's previous life experience, and they're going to consider what you say in the context of their experience. So asking about their experiences, first and foremost, how many people have ever been on a dairy farm before? How many people know about the average life cycle of a cow? How many people know some basic questions? Asking that question helps to inform your understanding of where they're coming from, and it allows you to start tailoring your response. If you had a group that said, not a single person has ever been on a dairy farm, to Gazinus's point, maybe they think that milk comes from the grocery store, right? You're going to change your approach compared to someone that says, look, I've been lived next door to a dairy farm. I spent my summers working there. You're going to change the approach in the way you communicate, right? And so now you be careful about that, because you're also going to make some assumptions. And so we need to appreciate that asking questions and considering their life experience is one thing, but we need to continue asking questions. Adults are pragmatic. They need a reason to learn something. Now, in this case, you don't need to worry about this as much. People have chosen to spend their time with you today or on this event. They're excited to be there. It's already primed to be a positive experience, likely a family experience. So they don't need a PhD in these topics. They want to know enough to satisfy some basic questions that they maybe have while having a fun day. But talking about what you do, why it's important, and what problems some types of practices solve is a really nice approach to make sure they understand the keys. If nothing else, telling people what you do and why you do it is always going to be best practice from a clarity perspective. What we care about is the why. Adults are self-directed. They do want to control at some level the how and when they learn. This needs to be given in multiple ways. Well, you've got some strong opportunity here. You're taking them on the farm already. There's a lot of areas to look at, a lot of stuff to look at, and a lot of stuff to talk about. And so you're already tapping into this adult learning principle just by doing the farm tour in and of itself. Adults need to see relevance and application. And so when you talk to them, first off, what questions are they asking you? Those are some of the areas that they're particularly interested in. So elaborate on those areas, build off of them, wrap them into your story, or frame your tour around them. In other situations, talk about why some of the information you're sharing is relevant from their perspective, and they should understand that is relevant from your perspective. And last, adults need to be involved and respected, which means adults want guidance. They need to be involved, and there needs to be sort of clear roles and responsibilities. So take an active interest in their thoughts, but again, be clear, you're facilitating this experience. You're not directing or controlling it. The experience, in other words, is going to be what they make it. They are part of the process, and tell them that first and foremost. I've got a plan on how we can conduct this tour, but I'm going to shake it up or I'm going to change it based on your questions, your level of interest, and I'm going to make this something that you won't forget anytime soon. And so I need your feedback, I need your questions, and I want to know what you're excited to learn about so we can get going and I can do just that. In a nutshell, those are some of the key principles behind how we set up environments or experiences that are more effective for adults to learn in the first place. The Breakfast on the Dairy Farm process in and of itself is a really effective adult learning tool right off the bat. But there's a few things you as the facilitator have control in, and I'm going to talk about some of those more in a moment, that can really have some influence. What's one thing you can take away from what you've just heard? Does anything resonate as something you could do differently? Is it helpful to know that some of the things you're already doing are really nicely aligned with adult learning? Is this something you've heard before? Any comments? Anyone want to come off mute and just share? Who's going to feel bad for me? Well, hopefully that was useful from the perspective of getting some sense as to some of the things to think about. The last section I want to go through is a little bit more focused on opportunities. So, questions you want to ask right off the out of the gate. How much do they know about the world of dairy farming? Do they have expectations coming in? And as I said before, what are your expectations for this tour, for this day, and what are your expectations of them? I want you to really think, are they comfortable asking you questions? And what I mean by that is thinking about all of those situations where you've got someone who knows nothing about dairy farming, but is a little shy about asking a dairy farmer a question that they perceive to be pretty silly. Breaking down some barriers by simply making some of these things explicit and telling them that the simple thing that most of us hear all the time, there's no such thing as a silly question. I can guarantee you, I've heard sillier in the past. I can guarantee you, I've heard all sorts of questions in the past. We are here, and I am here to help answer your questions specifically. So ask me. It's not just about saying those things. It's about making sure that when questions are posed, that you treat them respectfully, as though they're not silly, and give them the time. Those types of things are perceived as either an opportunity to say, hey, this is someone that's going to answer me and is going to make this a positive experience, versus someone that says, you know what, I feel like I've been a little bit judged based on that question, and I'm going to clam up now. It's an important influence here. Rose, you've got a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, is it something you should ask before the tour starts? Like, how many of you already know something about the farm? And then like as simple as possible. So like a cow gives milk, something like that. Should you ask that?
I've always been a fan of asking some simple questions and a show of hands, those kinds of things right off the bat. How many people have been on a dairy farm before? And you could even do, I've done in the past, like a quick quiz. I'm going to ask you 3 key questions. That's going to help me understand what your level of knowledge is. They're going to be really simple, so don't worry about it. And it'll be something fun for everybody. And then whatever those couple of questions are, it's a nice introduction. It gives a kickoff to your discussion, and you get a little bit of information or feedback back. So those are some opportunities. Everyone's style is a little bit different. So some of you might listen to that and say, you know what, that's not at all how I would approach it. And others might say, well, that's something that could work for certain groups. It's all about making this work for your style a little bit. But I'm a big fan of asking some simple questions off the bat, again, to get away from what I just mentioned, assumptions. I've got another slide that'll talk about assumptions in a moment. But Rose, that would be some of my thoughts around that in particular. I don't know if others have a perspective on that, if you've got a personal style or approach that you'd like to comment on.
I like that you elaborate a little bit more about this, Steve, like special about the approach. If you get away with a group of people, I put mostly a group together. You start with small groups, there's not a lot of people, but then the groups are growing because otherwise you don't get them through, and then you get suddenly 10 people. But what is your approach for kind of an icebreaker? What should you start off with? You don't walk to the first item or your first station and start about talking what's happening here. What is your approach to start a communication if you take the group with you? I think that could be helpful for others who haven't done this before.
Yeah, it's a great comment or question. And I want to throw it back. We've got a number of people that have done this before as well in this group. Others, what do you think? How would you approach that? I don't know. Greg, let me just look at our others in here. Whoops. Yvonne, I'm not sure if you've done them before. Any other thoughts? How would you break the ice with some of these conversations when you get a group together? How do you start things off on the right foot and get people engaged? Go ahead, Yvonne.
Yeah, we've done a lot of field trips with schools. So if there's little kids in the groups, there's usually it stinks, that seems to be the main one. It is usually an icebreaker because, we start all laughing right away, right? And the adults usually have something to say about that too to the children. So that's one for me that really always sticks out when the kids come along. And yeah, with the grown-ups, I don't know. You think when they come to the farm, they want to be there and they want to learn something. So it's usually not very hard to start, I find. They're usually very enthusiastic, I find.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. What you've just mentioned is something that I've done in a handful of situations, particularly with folks that really have no experience in the industry at all, is to say, so stop, take a look around. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? What do you feel? I do that because I know there are many of people that think about that. What's that smell? Like silage. What is that? What is that clanging? Headlocks. What are, and going on through the various things they might be thinking. It presents you an opportunity to get them talking about what are some of these things, and it cues you to what are some of the questions maybe right off the bat they might have. Another strategy that I've taken is quite literally the show of hands. How many people have done this before? How many people have been in a dairy farm before? What's one big question that you've got in term that we need to answer on this trip, for example? The other approach I've taken is what Rose had suggested, is asking a couple of questions and saying, quick trivia that's going to help me make this tour better. And then here's 3 quick questions. Everyone has a slightly different style or approach. Some of you will say, I want nothing to do with asking a Jeopardy or a trivia type question. Others might prefer to ask some open-ended question. And still, some others might say, prefer to do the traditional, welcome to so-and-so dairy farm. This is the number of cows that are milking, and a very traditional opening. What I would argue is if you're going to take the traditional opening approach by giving information, you need to stop at some point and you need to ask them a question. There's good research to suggest the longer that someone in a group spends not talking, the less and less likely they're going to talk at any other point in this experience. And that's true of our virtual training right now, right? So those of you that don't have your camera on are less likely to engage. Those of you that haven't come off mute are less likely to engage. And we see that right now as in this training. It's one of the reasons in virtual training in particular, but all trainings, we do icebreakers, because there's very good research to say the more time that passes when you don't say anything as an adult, the less likely you are to engage in the first place, regardless of what your personality is. So for me, and Gazinas, I don't know if you've got any thoughts you'd add in there, but those are a couple important ones from my perspective.
Yeah, I thought really simple actually, because the example you had there, everybody has that info sheet, the tour guides, and then they start talking exactly what you said, so many cows, welcome to this farm and stuff. But I think it has to be way lower level. You start just like, hey, where are you guys all coming from? How did you hear about this event? And that is also the comfort level from the participants and the tour guide to get a really good comfort level, I think. And that comes back to creating a positive experience and not just, talking about this farm and downloading the information. And I think that starts right away already if you walk away. And last year we had a person too, he was just married. He talked about that a little bit and stuff. And we all smiled and almost laughed about it a little bit because it was kind of funny, but everybody listened actually in that group and everybody was engaged. And that is where we really have to focus on more and more if we want to bring ourselves to the next level from transforming or the transformation from the information to these participants, and that it sticks with them, because it doesn't help much if they just hear and they get along with their day. And I think that was nice with the study too, like how much actually did stick with these consumers and the participants.
Yeah, I totally agree. And 2 things that are critical to what you've just said is that you are engaging with them in a way that's building rapport. Rapport is the #1 way to build trust between people, whether they have had a relationship before or not. And I mean any type of relationship. The other thing that you're talking about there is you're bringing, you're on a human level connecting with people. Those are the things that matter in terms of being receptive and open to information in the first place, or receptive and open to being influenced. And I know we're not all talking here about how do we influence people, but that's the reality of it. If we have a goal that is to not just raise awareness, but actually to demonstrate to people we do care about our cows and the environment, those things are fundamental to being a good dairy farmer, and by the way, running a profitable business. And so, you know, you hear people talk about those messages all the time, but they land flat because we don't have relationships, we don't have rapport, we don't have the engagement that makes people open to that being receptive in the first place. And so that's a human level piece that the Breakfast on the Dairy Farm in particular allows you to add or have. So let's talk about, here again is that slide about making sure we're listening to understand where people are coming from, not just to respond to their question. There are multiple ways we can ask questions. We can ask open-ended questions. So who, what, where, why, when, how. If we ask questions that start with those, they will result in answers that require people to explain themselves, not to just answer yes or no. We can get people to, we can use starting questions or probes or redirects. So again, this is the one I would recommend you use at least a few times in your tour, every tour. That's a good question. What do others think? For me, that would be a simple question to get people thinking, and for you to take some time to collect your thoughts in the meantime. One of the most important strategies to being an effective communicator is active listening. That is sort of this figure here. Maintaining eye contact, which is both respectful and demonstrating you're engaged. Asking those open questions and asking probing questions to try and understand and demonstrate, hey, I care about what you have to say here and I want to understand where you're coming from. Clarifying what they're saying or paraphrasing and so on. A lot of you are asking similar questions. How long does it take to milk a cow every day? How much milk does she produce? So a lot of you are curious about the dairy cow itself. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. It demonstrates that you care about where they're coming from, you understand, or you're trying to understand where they're coming from, and you're responding in kind. And that, in a nutshell, demonstrates to humans, to people, that you care. That's what this is about at a human level, that you are making a connection with an individual or a small group. There are steps to listening. There is flat out not listening. There is pretending to listening. If you have kids, at least at a certain age, everyone's got a phone nowadays. It's that, you know, looking at the phone and you're having a conversation, trying to be effective, but you know they're not really listening there. There's autobiographical listening. That's when someone asks you a question or tells you about a problem, and your first response is to tell them about a time you had the experience, the same problem. It's you turning their problem, their issue that they're sharing with you, and turning it on yourself. It's relatable, but the problem is you're taking the focus off of them and putting it on yourself. There's helping listening. This is where most of us have found ourselves in the doghouse with a partner, where they've expressed a problem or an issue or a challenge, and the first thing you've done is to explain to them how they could have prevented that problem or how they could address that solution if they just took your advice. How validating and how supportive does that feel? Not often, right? Even though that might be just what they need to hear. What they need first is empathy. Collectively, what we benefit from and what we relate to most as individuals is feeling like we're being heard. Someone cares about what we have to say, and they understand we're frustrated, we're mad, we're curious, whatever it is, and then following backwards, going down the staircase, offering some advice, offering some ideas, maybe sharing a story or a time when you've experienced the same type of thing. Those first 3 steps become so important, but no matter what, even if someone asks a silly question, that empathy piece of maybe they're a little shy, maybe they're a little uncertain if that's even the right question to ask, validating that first and then starting to offer some other feedback is the best way to relate to people. So how do we build rapport and why? It's the #1 way to build trust and demonstrate you care. So where do you have shared values? Where do you have similar similarities? So Kazinas, what you mentioned is such a perfect example. I always joke, especially when I'm in the United States, I always joke and say, Canadians are always talking about the weather. Well, all of us are always talking about the weather. And why is that? Not because Canada's unique and not because there's so much, although there is so much different weather going on, it's because we all share the weather. No matter who we are, where we're from, what we think, there's something we can relate to. So anytime you go into a meeting room and someone says, you know, it hasn't rained in a month, we're sharing that perspective. And that, of course, has different impacts on us, but it's a relatable item that we can all talk about. Remember, we judge people and their intentions instantly, and we judge them based on how they look, how they sound, what kind of words they use, all of that. Rapport enables us to have better conversations. So starting, like Gesine said, by building some relationship or building some simple rapport early on is going to set us up for better success and a more positive outcome right off the bat. Showing empathy and demonstrating you care about understanding their perspective, such as, again, going to that example of why aren't the cows getting outside at all? Why do you think that's important to you? Why would that be important to you? From, asking a genuine question back to them, not to challenge them, but to get a better understanding of their perspective. It demonstrates that you care. And if you can do that without feeling judgmental or contrarian, if you can ask them and say, I genuinely understand or care about where you're coming from here, that really can help to build this rapport. Remember that so much of communication is nonverbal, so much of it, right? This picture tells us a million things, despite what we know and think about some of these leaders. There's so many things we can unpack from just a simple image. Or, to put it another way, I can look at those of you that have a camera. In fact, you see me sort of, where I'm looking right now is here. Why am I looking here this entire time? Because I'm not looking at my slides. I'm looking at the 4 or 5 of you that have your cameras on. You are giving me feedback, even though you're not saying anything. I have a sense of what is landing, what you think might be humorous, when you're checking out or not engaged anymore. And that's giving me something that I can use. And I encourage you to do the same. There's so many times when I work with producers on a farm, and you can see that everyone's looking in a different direction. What are they interested in? They're clearly not engaged in me in this particular time. So what are they interested in? Right? There's nonverbal communication that's influencing things. So we need to appreciate that there is engagement on the left, and there is disengagement, boredom, or straight up, I'm about to fall asleep, engagement on the right. There are a variety of tools and techniques, and we could do a day-long course on nonverbal communications. I'm not gonna beat that to death. But remember, the simple things of an open posture, a smile, slightly forward leaning, eye contact, affirmative body gestures. So if someone's talking to you and you're kind of nodding your head, or that kind of thing, that means a lot. And it gives people cues that, again, you're interested, you're engaged, and you care about what they have to say. And it influences us more than you can possibly appreciate, in terms of them feeling like they are respected, they're valued, and that they should continue to do what they're doing right now in terms of engaging in conversation. So lead by example. You want them to be open and transparent? Be open and transparent yourself. What should they expect of you? I'm going to be honest about our challenges or our issues. I'm going to be fun and entertaining, whatever it is you feel comfortable talking about. But again, what do you expect of them? As I've said already, explain the why. Make sure you communicate about whether it's your goals and philosophy or just the why behind a specific practice. You're committed to meeting their needs or understanding their problems and responding in kind. Some of you might have seen or heard about this in the past. This is called the golden circle around why. The bullet point here is people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. In short, people are more motivated by understanding why you do something than specifically what it is you do. And there's a lot of things in the dairy industry we could benefit from thinking about the communication around this approach. So what are we talking about here? Well, this is an example that was used by a very popular, now popular presenter online. And he said, a lot of people talk about their message or share their message in the following ways. They start on this outer circle. They say, what do we do? Then they say, how do we do it? And then they say why we do it. So he used the example of Microsoft Windows, I think it was, or Microsoft as a company. He said, you know what? We build fantastic computers that push the boundaries of technology every day and every year. How do we do that? We have a massive team of engineers, the brightest minds in the world today, working on our machines and our technologies. Why do we do it? Because we think that leading technology is going to bring the human race into the next century, something like that. And then they say, well, let's look at how Apple products communicates and talks about their same sector, but their approach. And he says they start from why and work out. So he says, what's our purpose? Well, at Apple, we believe in challenging the status quo and doing things differently. How? Our products are beautifully designed and easy to use. And what's the result? We make computers. The point is what sticks with you is the why, the drive, the passion. That's what sticks with you, not the what. And so what is it that we do? We produce milk. We produce safe milk, nutritious milk, all of those adjectives we could start using. How do we do that? We have a number of pregnant animals and they produce milk over a specific lactation, and that's how we set up our farms, ensuring that they have a quality of life and so on. And why do we do that? Because we believe fundamentally that safe, happy, healthy cows, you know, produce safe, happy, healthy milk or something to that effect. The point being is that the why is so much more relatable, so much more motivational than the how and the what. The other thing, and just rounding out my presentation here, is that when it comes to situations where we don't align, maybe someone's challenging us and saying, you know what, I really don't agree with the fact that calves are removed from their mothers at birth, or I really don't agree that calves aren't socially housed, or whatever the case is. The thing that we need to appreciate, whether we're feeling judged or not, is that we are often defensive far too soon. Well, research shows, or you know what, nothing's perfect, or this is the way we've done it for a number of years, or you know what, we've realized that this is in fact the best way to do it. We're defensive. We are better off demonstrating showing some empathy and demonstrating that we're interested in understanding why they think what they do. Asking some questions, listening, and responding in kind. As I said, the goal isn't here is to get agreement across the board. In some cases, we might agree to disagree. I don't think you're going to run into too many contentious conversations while you're doing a breakfast on the dairy farm. But when we think about communication from the dairy industry more broadly, we're defensive, I think, in some cases too often, or simply too soon. So just something to think about. So what are our immediate reactions? I think we need to remain calm or realize that maybe we're feeling a bit defensive. Try not to take it personally and be immediately defensive or reactive, but listen, ask for some questions, and remember, nonverbal communication is key here. If we're crossing our arms, if we start to become more closed, we're demonstrating to them we're uncomfortable, we don't want to talk about this, we're feeling frustrated, and so on. But recognizing their concern or their questions and being respectful and assertive and saying, maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit more because it's a deep issue or it's a complex issue. And maybe it's not something that everyone agrees on, even in the industry, for example. Right? I could talk to consumers for days about the things that we don't have enough science on or that we in the industry don't agree on, right? From social housing to cow-calf separation to environmental management, there are a lot of different opinions and ideas out there on what's the right thing to do. And as you all can appreciate, the right thing to do often changes every decade or so. And so it's important we appreciate this is all an evolution. The last couple of comments for me is to appreciate that it's important. Most of us are seeking some sort of validation. So normalizing people's concerns or their questions, that's not a silly question. I've heard that question many times before. Would be a simple way to affirm and say, you're not alone. You're not the only person. Don't feel silly for asking that question. The same would be true if someone asks a more serious or more contentious question. Why do we not have cows getting outside enough? You know, that's a question we actually get a lot. And it's something that as farmers, we think about a lot as well. And here's why we do what we do. And here's how some of the things we've done to manage the situation. So as I round out our presentation here, I want you to write down one thing that you think you're doing well when it comes to being a facilitator or working through a breakfast on the dairy farm. And if you haven't done one before, what's something you think you're good at when it comes to communication? And I want you to write one other thing down that you think you can do better. Maybe based on what I've said, maybe based on what you've heard others say, and something maybe you want to try as you move forward.